really powerful in helping us make sense of things together. And they work best when there's a shared frame of reference or shared experience we can draw on. So I'll share mine. Fire obviously has connotations of cozy warmth, danger, or the spark of inspiration, or the heat of conflict, etc. My own interest in the fire as a metaphor now comes from my own hobby. I spend rather a lot of time building fires in my home-built brick pizza oven. And so I give a lot of thought to building fires for productive rather than destructive reasons. And I'm going to extend this metaphor into my next slide. Let's make sure this works. Yeah. Which is one view of our post-COVID environment. And the metaphor here is that many of us, I think, may have felt since COVID that we've been constantly fighting fires and trying to put out fires started by others. First, just to state the obvious, there was lockdown and emergency online teaching. But since then, we've been weathering a range of crises, political, economic, climate related. And now we've got new technological disruptions with all of the generative AI tools that we see around us. And being in this constant emergency mode really just feels overwhelming and exhausting and can lead to burnout for students and for teachers. I recently Googled EAP for a completely different purpose, and one of the top hits was what you see here, Emergency Action Plan, which is totally different, but I thought, well, this is horribly apt for what we've been going through. So what can we do to get away from this? And we've been moving away from this as much as we can, and so that we can become less like firefighters and become more productive for ourselves, but also to better meet the needs of our students. So basically getting back to our core purpose. So how can we do this? Well, the first part of my answer is to just reflect on how there are always disruptions and challenges. They may be to greater or lesser extents, but disruption is almost the norm. So given the constant disruptions, how do we get back to lighting fires rather than firefighting? And how can we focus on student needs? So as a rather long answer to this, I'd first like to look back, to go to just over 10 years ago, to a previous educational disruption. And that would be what you could call the time of the MOOC. Some of you will remember the massive open online courses. We heard a reference before to Coursera, and there are many other platforms that produce these massive open online courses. I'm hearing a slight sound, but I'll keep going. Someone please stop me if the sound goes a bit funny. So massive open online courses were exactly what they sounded like. Education open to tens, even hundreds of thousands of people at the same time. Famously, the New York Times, the American newspaper, referred to 2012 as the year of the MOOC, a major innovation for our time. And it wasn't just the popular press. The screenshots you see here are just some snippets of some academic journals from around that time, all engaging in the discussion about whether these massive courses, this new technological event, were a disruption or a challenge, an innovation or a resolution. So I bring this up because I was involved in EAP at that time, and I was involved with my own institution in developing a massive open online course. Let me just move my slide on. So a University of Reading initiative to develop an EAP open online course focused on academic writing. We were using the UK platform called FutureLearn. And why do I bring this up? It's to just delve into how it was a time of great excitement, but also challenge and disruption. We were developing materials in what felt like a novel technological context, and we were very concerned about how we'd meet the needs of our students when we were expecting thousands, and in fact, it ended up being tens of thousands of students during a 5-week online writing course. However, and this is what my takeaway was, I was quickly struck when we got into discussion with the people at FutureLearn was how they reminded us to keep things simple and true to our pedagogical and to their pedagogical principles. And it's a lesson that we all know, but I've been reminded of ever since. So the FutureLearn approach was based on what you can see here, social learning and community. And as they said, conversation is a fundamental mechanism for learning. Now, this was underpinned by something called conversation theory that was, I think, originally proposed by the British educational technologist called Gordon Pask and then developed by further researchers. It was this belief that learning occurs through conversations about a subject matter, and that serves to make the knowledge explicit. But I'm slightly subverting that later, but it's this idea that conversation is important to learning. So what am I taking from this is the importance of two simple principles, community and conversation as a way of making things explicit. And these are the two areas I'd like to focus on when we're talking about meeting student needs. Now, this in turn brings me to this quote by Bell Hooks from her 1994 book, Teaching to Transgress. And you can see here, the quote says, as a classroom community, our capacity to generate excitement is deeply affected by our interest in one another, in hearing one another's voices, in recognizing one another's presence. And I think this, to a certain extent, brings back these ideas of community and conversation. She talks about hearing one another's voices. Now, I can't do justice to the breadth and depth of her book. If any of you have read it, you'll understand that. But I'd just like to highlight her particular call in it for something she calls an engaged pedagogy. It's a pedagogy that creates a space for the personal in the classroom, an approach that brings in the diversity of experiences and allows for transgressing any boundaries that can alienate our students. I think her book, even though it's 30 years old at this point, is still relevant now and relevant to our discussion of student needs. Now, the educational environment has changed since 1994, and there is indeed a greater emphasis on learner-centered pedagogy. But we're still experiencing a highly marketized university sector, at least in the UK. So I find that her focus on the relational connections between teachers and learners resonates very strongly. And so I'm going to take these ideas about community and conversation forward in the next part of my talk. And this will be basically my top level answer to how we can address our student needs. And I'll start first with this idea of community. So our students, what do our students need? Community. The importance of community to student needs is pretty widely recognized. Many universities make it part of their strategy. University of Reading, my university does. And it's actually so widespread in the sector, it might even be a bit of a buzzword at this point. Now, what I'm showing here is an excerpt from the Advanced HE Student Needs Framework that they produced in 2023. It's an excerpt that I've adapted to show the two central elements of their framework. And you can see that core to their framework is the importance of belonging and community. Advanced HE, many of you will know this, is an organization focused on improving higher education for staff, students and society. So it certainly has an influential voice in UK higher education, at least. And I'd like to delve into this further. They really argue that this framework enables a spotlight on student needs, especially through its ability to create an open dialogue, which again is my theme of conversation. They further break down the core element of belonging community into these constituent areas that you can see listed on the right. And you'll see the focus on meaningful relationships is important as well, which I will slightly extend to include this idea of dialogue and conversation. Now, it's a very valuable framework, but useful to unpick it a little bit, because like many models, it's perhaps a little bit tidy. And there is always a danger with tidy models that they can be just that, an aspiration. And there's a term used by an North American academic called John Bennett. He refers to this as apple pie, which I take to mean being a buzzword, a little bit pretty, but not enough substance. Now, I'm citing John Bennett because his analysis of the idea of academic community is rather useful here. Now, his research on academic community is primarily concerned with the faculty and the staff, but I argue that his model and his approach is highly applicable to student needs as well. So what I'd like to do now is look a little closer at this idea of academic community. So Bennett says that to achieve community, we first need hospitality. And he defines hospitality as radical openness. And it's counter, he says, to an insistent individualism that can pervade higher education. And I'd like to pause and appreciate his use of this idea. Hospitality is a very welcome counter, in my view, to the current environment in parts of the UK, which can sometimes feel a little bit unhospitable to our students. So this hospitality and openness to our students is a really positive idea in many ways. Now, hospitality echoes work done by the French deconstructionist thinker Jacques Derrida, who deconstructs the complex dynamics of power and vulnerability between individuals. So it's still almost breakfast time in the UK and a little bit early to delve into Derrida, who's anyway a bit difficult, and I'm not an expert. But his idea of openness between host and guest, or perhaps even between teacher and student, is what I'd want to remember. So we want hospitality to engage with our students. And according to Bennett, the way we practice hospitality is through conversation, this respectful engagement and honest, critical dialogue. So to come back to student needs, this is the top level way that we can meet our student needs through radical openness and the conversation and respectful engagement. So how do we have these conversations with the students to get at their needs? So there are many ways in which we have conversations with students, and we do this as teachers all the time in the classroom. We have meaningful conversations, and it can be quite straightforward. And this word cloud here includes learners on it, but shows some other ways in which we engage with our students in conversation. You can see the word participants. We may engage with them in our research. They may be participants in questionnaires or focus groups, and we can determine a lot of about their needs from that. They may be representatives, you can see that word there, at boards of studies or committee meetings to represent the student voice, and that's all very important. So these are very useful ways we can have conversations, but it's really important throughout this that we abide by these principles listed at the bottom of my slide, noted by Beauville, who's a useful reference for student engagement and partnership. And she points out the principles of shared respect, shared responsibility, and reciprocity. Now, we always aim for this, but it's always worth being reminded of checking that we are indeed managing it in our interactions and conversations with students. Boville adds that there's robust evidence to show that positive student-teacher relationships can lead to multiple benefits in higher education, which is sort of obvious to all of us, but the research does underpin that. But do we always have this shared responsibility and reciprocity in our conversations with students? And the answer is sometimes, but not always. And it's something we need to keep striving for, to really have meaningful conversations with a more openness. And if you look at some of the other roles listed here, some of these lend themselves perhaps more to shared responsibility and openness. For example, working with students when they're the experts, when they're the teachers, when they're the authors, and so on and so forth. So I've been able to engage with students in different ways in conversation and really had some great experiences that I'd like to share all of them with you, but in the limits of time, I thought I'd talk about my engagement with students as researchers as a way of highlighting some of the benefits and challenges of trying to have these open, honest, even vulnerable conversations with students. Oh, my slide, isn't moving. So I'm going to give an example of my involvement with some student research partners within a program called the Undergraduate Research Opportunities Program, shortened to Europe. We have it at my university, and I think many other universities run this program or similar. Importantly, in this program, the student researchers are valued both intellectually and in monetary value. They are paid. So they engage with the academic community, they develop and share skills and develop and share expertise, and essentially they conduct research. In my experience, from the nature of social science that we do, they've been involved especially in surveys and focus groups and the analysis. And equally importantly, they present and publish. I've participated in 3 such projects. I've learned enormously from the process and from the students, and I believe the students have benefited from this type of conversation. So it's a really good, although not perfect, way of engaging in conversation with our students. So here's an example of one particular project that I was involved with. The title you can see is Engagement and Integration, Chinese Students' Expectations of Academic Study at the University of Reading. With student-led research, and I've picked it because the findings related strongly to the idea of community, which is relevant to what I'm talking about. So it was a very small study, but just as an aside, what was interesting, what came out of it, was the student hopes and anxieties encompassing their future social and professional situations, which highlighted the importance of what Pavlenko and Norton call the imagined community. This is the idea that the imagination of future networks and situations can impact learners as much as their immediate environment. So their student hope and fear for future roles or memberships can play a key part in their experiences, feelings, and motivation in the current classroom situation. So that's about the findings of the project. But I think what's more important is how this was a conversation between the student researcher, the student participants, and me, and how this conversation was instrumental in enhancing our understanding of the complexity of student needs. And first of all, I'll start by saying that this conversation did not always involve me. And that's a particularly important thing, that conversations are key, but we don't have to be in control. And that was a feature of the process that I'd like to talk about, which is conversations with students. To be truly open and vulnerable, we may need to readjust our expectations and perhaps our position of power and responsibility. So we had a very good relationship with the student who led this project. She was fantastic, highly capable. But I had to learn to let go and be more vulnerable and more open and more sharing. I must say it was a bit uncomfortable for me because I'm a bit of a control freak, but that's by the by. We had an induction and agreed on the way she would approach it, but she then approached it in much of her own way. The questions she designed, the way she led the focus groups were not the way I would have done it. And of course, she often had much better results than I would have done because she was a student researcher having a conversation with students. She had an excellent rationale for what she did, and her expertise and her insight really enhanced what we were doing. And the quote here that you see is a quote that she took from one of her focus groups that certainly took me aback. I personally wouldn't have gone around quoting mentions of cockroaches, but when she put it in her poster and talked about it with others and included it with other students, you could see that it resonated really well. And again, this was all part of the letting go of my sense of what was right to listen to what the students had to tell us. So, the message is open conversation, shared expertise, shared respect, but it also comes with vulnerability, messiness, and perhaps surprise as the dynamics can shift, and they should shift in these sort of conversations. So it was a valuable process. That's my last point on this slide, but with challenges and also with limitations. It was a very small scale initiative. And there is a danger of engaging only with individuals who are already super engaged. So I'm not going to over-egg what we achieved, just the lessons that we have learned from all of these conversations with students. So I'm going to slowly move towards my conclusions and the lessons we've learned, or I've learned from these experiences. So let me just move ahead. And it's this idea of looking for simplicity in what we do, and in this case, within the educational interface. So my main conclusion, therefore, is that we aim to keep it simple when we can, and we don't beat ourselves up with complexity. There's complexity all around us, and we can't ignore it, but we can get back to the core of what we do. So I've quoted Kahu and Nelson here, who argue that we all operate within what they call this complex educational interface, which is the institutional context that we work in, has multiple individuals with multiple needs and multiple stakeholders trying to meet their needs, establish their authority, their concerns, raise their questions. So how can we work and interact in this interface when this balance keeps shifting around us is, my answer is to take us back a little bit to this idea of engaged pedagogy, or my interpretation of engaged pedagogy. And oops, just having trouble advancing my slide. So my almost final conclusion is one of simplicity, is that meeting student needs is so many needs, so many ways we can meet them, but an overarching answer is that we can aim to meet student needs through mutual engagement and hospitality, and true hospitality, which involves this messiness and vulnerability on both sides. And it's an echo to Bell Hook's engaged pedagogy that's student-centered and very caring and focused on the personal. Now, all the disruptions around us, that's what that fire is, that match is, have been challenging, but they provide us the opportunity to reflect on this, and brings me back to the metaphor. So now we can start lighting the fires of conversation and community. And yes, we do it, but we can think more deeply about how we do it in more open and more balanced ways, and keep doing it. And this brings me back then to my metaphor once again. If you can see the picture on the bottom there, it's of a fire. Now, this is what I would call a top-down fire. And a top-down fire is the type of fire I build in my pizza oven. And it's done a tiny bit differently to the fires I learned to build when I was a Girl Scout. You build it from the bottom up, of course, big logs on the bottom, and you build a sort of square raft and construction of your logs, but then you put the kindling at the top and you light it from the very top. So the building takes a lot more planning to get the structure right. It's carefully built in a nice log structure. Why do you do this? Well, anyone can build it. You could even build it together. And I've sometimes built this alone or sometimes with other people. But the metaphor is that it's easier to lights more quickly, but then it lasts longer and there's less danger of collapse because it's built right from the beginning. So I think that by lighting this kind of fire, where we focus on the basic structure first, we can generate excitement, we can generate critical thinking, and we can generate resilience. And this is how we have impact. Many of you are already doing this in your classrooms. This is just a reminder of what we do and what we do best, that we are supporting our students to wield, to engage their skills and judgment in the face of current and future challenges. So I don't mean to make it sound all too easy, and it isn't always comfortable, but we and our students deserve to make this a priority. We can move beyond the small groups of super engaged students towards a whole class approach. And equally importantly, we need to continue to urge our institutions to allow us the space to prioritize this. The institutions have the responsibility just as much as we do for keeping the personal and the human in higher education and in our teaching. So by way of a real conclusion now, I'd like to end with a final quote from bell hooks. And it comes back to this idea of mutual engagement. I journey with students as they progress in their lives beyond our classroom experience. In many ways, I continue to teach them, even as they become more capable of teaching me. The important lesson that we learn together, the lesson that allows us to move together within and beyond the classroom, is one of mutual engagement. And this is why I think it doesn't matter who lights the fire if we've been engaged with each other in building it together. So that is the end of my presentation. In true academic style, I have a few references, and that is it. If there is a little bit of time, I'm happy to take questions.